Welcome to The Ripple, where extraordinary women executives share their turning points, growing pains, breakthroughs, and triumphs to help you show up with confidence. I'm your host, Ashley Lobbs, and today we're joined by the inspiring Stacey Copas, author of How to Be Resilient, host of Resilience Rock Sales podcast, and Sales Resilience keynote speaker. Today she's sharing how one conversation helped her reframe a tragic accident into a meaningful career. Well, Stacey, thank you so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to have you.
I'm so excited to be here, and I think the podcast, the whole idea behind the podcast, and I've loved being part of the Wednesday Women community, so it's so cool to actually be able to come and have a live conversation about it all.
Yeah, it's really nice to tell the stories of all these women leaders in a new way and just make more role models available to people. I think that's what we're missing is just more women speaking out, right?
Definitely, and yeah, I love that Wednesday Women's doing such a good job of it, and yeah, I even just each profile that comes up, I'm just like, I shoot a little message over, and it's like connecting via Wednesday Women, and it's definitely broadened my network. So I think this is just going to be another way to amplify that further.
Yeah, everybody should follow that advice. You see someone cool on LinkedIn, you just add them, just go for it. I totally agree with that. I want to hear about the work that you're doing. Can you tell me a little bit about it and just why you love it?
Yeah, so my work, I founded the Academy of Resilience, and that was after writing the book How to Be Resilient many, many years ago. And I sort of started out mainly just keynoting, and I absolutely adore keynoting because it's just the best opportunity to connect with a whole stack of people in a small amount of time. But it's like having a one-on-one conversation with, anywhere from 20 to 1,000 people in one go. And I love that being able to just share my story and then share some, really actionable takeaways to help people to put their challenges into perspective and help them to shift the way that they look at change and adversity and uncertainty. But I guess look, my whole vision around what I do is getting people to start to see their obstacles as opportunities and their problems as possibilities. And so these days I'm not doing as much in-person keynoting, mostly doing, podcasting and doing some coaching and doing virtual stuff. And I just love it. It's been an absolute gift to have had the life I've had that's enabled me to have the experiences I've had and then being able to then translate into simple practical takeaways for people to apply in their lives so that they can learn some of the things that I have without all of the drama in the process.
I mean, that's the goal is to learn from people who have been there and then avoid all of their mistakes. But it sounds like you get to be optimistic for a living, and that's a pretty cool thing.
It is, and it's one of those things too because I think, look, optimism and hope and all of those type of things are super important, but not sort of just blind optimism. I had one of my podcast guests recently talk about cruel optimism, and I thought, oh, that was a really
Mm.
interesting way about it, where it just becomes. I said it's kind of likened it to the toxic positivity, where it's just so extreme that it actually gets people to discount some of the other experiences and some of the feelings they have. And that's been a big lesson that I've had along the way is that it's super important to feel like we're looking forward to something, we're being pulled into the future by something that is bigger than us, but it's also, really important. And it's something that I overlooked for so long was the stopping and experiencing and feeling the things in the moment. So yeah, it's a little bit of a balancing act between being present, experiencing things as they happen, but then having that optimism. And I like to say, the best is yet to come. And people go, well, how do you know that? I'm like, well, that's just my belief. And I think if we can sort of go we sort of feel that there's great things still ahead, then that helps us, especially when times are challenging.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's not about dismissing, struggle and pain and negative things that do happen. But it sounds like it's really just maintaining a belief in the positive despite that.
For sure, for sure. I think that's really important. But yeah, not living too much in the future, because if we live too much in the future, then we really miss the moments as they happen. And that's the stuff that is super important is being really present in the moment.
Yeah, that's a really great lesson because so often when we are stressed about something or anxious about something, it's the past or the future, and it's not actually right now. It's not this exact moment.
It's true, and, really, if we find ourselves sort of dwelling on the past, that's where depression tends to live. It's that whole beating yourself up about, what already happened, and anxiety is a future state. And, yeah, if we are really present in the moment, if we do just take those deep breaths in the moment and really ground ourselves and just feel what's happening right here, then it's really not possible to get too bogged down in either of those states.
Well, and I imagine that's so much a part of what you talk about with resilience. How did you get to this place where that became your focus?
It's so interesting because the word resilience was not a word that I'd ever used myself, and it was a mentor that put the label on that about 12 years ago or so. But to take you back, the way that I sort of came into that space is back when I was 12 years old, which is 30 something years ago now. I had an accident where I broke my neck and drowned in a backyard swimming pool, and that left me a quadriplegic, needing a wheelchair for the rest of my life. And at the time I was a talented athlete, academically I was doing brilliantly, so I had my whole life turned upside down, like, in a moment. And it was years in the darkness after that, and eventually I started to I worked my way out of it. I started to shift the way I looked at what happened, and over time, I ended up getting to the point where I really felt that I needed to do something bigger and better with my life than what I was doing. And that was how I ended up eventually working with coaches and mentors. And it was one of those coaches who she actually said, "Resilience, this is exactly what it is. If you share your story and you share those lessons that you've learned, then you could teach other people resilience." And so I did. I reverse engineered the process of my life. But, that didn't come immediately. There was a huge resistance to telling my story because I'm Australian, and the tall poppy syndrome is such a huge issue here in Australia, and I think it's even more prominent for women. And
I don't know
there's
what that means. Can you tell me what that means?
Oh, okay. So the tall poppy syndrome is that if you think of poppies growing, and what it is that the tall ones, the short ones,
Mhm.
chop them down to try and bring them back down to their level, because it's this whole, attacking people who are successful, or there's this
Mm.
perception that there's something, they've done something wrong. But yeah, it's a huge issue in Australia, and from what I understand, I think it's a big issue too in, like, Canada and Britain and stuff like that as well, but especially in Australia, especially for women. And I grew up in an area that was, very low socioeconomic and things like that. So we were never brought up to celebrate success. We were never brought up to stand out and say, wow, I'm really proud of what I've done. It was more, growing up with, you would hear your parents and other people, someone on TV that was successful or rich or anything like that, and they would attack them. So there was
Mm.
never an encouragement to go, oh my gosh, I'm going to stand out. And if anything, it was the opposite. It was trying to minimize yourself. So, yeah, so I didn't wanna share my story, and I said, I said to it was another mentor, I said to him, I said, "Look, I don't wanna share my story because everyone will think I'm a total wanker for talking about myself." And I'm sure that, there's different versions of it in different parts of the world, but, a lot of us, and particularly as women, there is this fear, and then there's the imposter syndrome and stuff like that. So yeah, and at this time I was getting some help with, publicity and writing and speaking and stuff like that. And through the course of this particular program, I was there because I wanted to raise awareness and money for some work I'd been doing in developing countries around mentoring people with disability. And so that was my goal. And it was at the end of this workshop that my mentor said, in front of the whole room of people, he said, "Stacey, you need to be sharing your story." And I'm like, "No, I don't want to do it." He goes, "Stace, with a story like yours, if you don't share, you're being selfish." And I was like, wow,
That's a big moment.
it was. And I'm like, how can I argue with that? He said, sharing your story and being a speaker or sharing any kind of information, training, coaching, any of that type of stuff. He said, it's about your audience. It's not about you. So get over yourself.
It's so interesting that you made this choice, inspired by what happened in your life, a very personal choice to make it your career also. And at the same time, you struggled to share your own story. What were you doing before that? Like, what were you sharing? What was your work about before it was about you?
Yeah, I just did normal jobs, I guess. It was one of those things that after I had my injury, because before I had my injury, all I wanted to do was be a vet. And then
Mm.
being a quadriplegic, not even having full use of my hands or anything like that, I couldn't do the training, I couldn't do the work. So, that really it was a real struggle. And then I ended up just I just didn't get yeah, I drifted from job to job. I worked in engineering and, did like different admin, project management type stuff. But, I never really felt fulfilled. It always felt like a job. I'd be somewhere until I felt like I kind of mastered it. I get bored. Generally, there was a bit of a 2-year window that happened. Each 2 years, it was like, "I need to do something different." And back then, in the, late '90s, early 2000s, it probably wasn't looked upon as favorably as it is now. I think there's always this little window, isn't it? It's like if you stay too long, people think you're not ambitious, and if you move too quickly, they think you're unreliable. So I just moved, and then, yeah, I had the opportunity to do some volunteer work in the Solomon Islands, and that was that shift for me going, "Oh my gosh, there is something about my story." But again, I thought it was going to be, how could I help change the lives of people in with disability in developing countries? But yeah, that like my previous work up to that, yeah, management, project management, that type of stuff. So completely unrelated, but it did actually help me because, when I first started speaking about resilience, I mainly spoke in the context of leadership and change. And so I was able to then relate some of those things that I'd been doing in my work and in different sectors, and particularly like looking at, continuous improvement and stuff like that. And obviously, when we're looking for continuous improvement, we've got to try new things. And, when we try new things, they don't always work the first time. So there's an element of resilience that's involved in that. So it's worlds away from, what I did in the past. It's now been 12 years since I left that last job. And it's been amazing. I could never go back to being employee. I think I'm proudly unemployable now.
It's fascinating to hear how centering your story and your experience in your work created meaning for you. And it seems like it was very different from what you were doing before. Why do you think that centering yourself was such a hard thing to do?
I think a lot of it was going back to that fear of, being judged or being pulled back or anything like that. But and then also just that initially it was that fear that it was that so what factor. It was like,
Mm.
well, okay, this is my story, but so what? But this is where I had another mentor who first saw me. He was in the audience when I first shared my story on stage, and it was only the 5-minute version of my story at an event. And he actually said to me afterwards, he goes, "Oh, are you speaking professionally?" And I'm like, "No, that's the first time I've ever done that." And so he said, "Well, oh my," he said, "Look, you've got all of the elements. You make people laugh, you make people cry." He said, "If you can then tie your story to actionable takeaways and make it relevant and make it so that people then can connect your story to something that's relevant that they can implement themselves," he said, "you could do this forever." And, that was that moment, and that's where I realized that you hear a lot of people go to a conference and they'll hear a speaker and they'll go, "That was inspiring," but 2 days later, they're like, "So what did they actually talk about that meant anything for me?" There can be that again, that "so what" factor, and I never wanted to be one of those speakers. I never wanted someone to go, "That was amazing, but so what?" And so that's where it was, again, grounding in that story and then being able to make it relatable, give people takeaways so that they can then also, if you tie the takeaways to a story, then people are more likely to remember those takeaways as well.
What advice do you have for somebody who wants to share their story, but maybe they're afraid to do the same?
I think the first thing to do is just to start to do it in, perhaps just start to do it in increments. Because sometimes I think if we try and go too big too soon, then, we may not have a great experience, and then we may then go back into our shell and then be terrified to ever do it again. So I think just doing it in little increments. So it can just be even just starting by maybe sharing a little bit more about, yourself or your story just in conversation and with other people. Then it could be, in a meeting setting. Then it could be, you might have the opportunity in a networking event or something like that to go and be the guest speaker. But I think just the big thing for me was it was starting small and then getting feedback and then getting the responses from people, but always thinking about what do I want someone to take away from this?
Mhm.
Because that then also when we're focused on the audience, when we're focused on the other person, then it actually takes the stress off ourselves as well. And so
Mhm.
if we go in there from and sharing our story as an act of service with that intention to actually give someone it's a gift in a way. If you can give them a gift wrapped in a story, then it's one of those things that sometimes even now I might be about to speak and then you get the nerves kick in, but then I always picture that there's one person in that room that something's going on in their life. And if I don't go out there and I don't share completely open-hearted, open-minded, connect with the room and particularly that person, that, perhaps their life may not improve because I held back. So, I think the
Yeah,
more we can make it about everyone else, the less stress and the less fear that we have in ourselves.
right, and it's not so much about what people are going to think of us, but more how we're giving a gift to someone else.
Yeah,
I
and it's
love
up to them
that.
to accept that gift or not, but again, once we put it out there, we have no control over how people take it, how they respond to it. But again, if we come from that place of generosity, act of service, for me now, my word of the year is joy. So I'm always looking at, okay, how can I be of joyful service to other people? If we bring it back to that, then it does start to remove the fear from it.
What does that look like to you to bring more joy into your practice?
Being present is a huge part of it. It's also looking for the fun in things as well, but also just really being grateful and appreciative of everything that I have, every experience I have. That's a really big one. And sometimes it's just I talk a lot about gratitude, and then I've realized over the last year or so that if I add smiling with gratitude, then that really does bring that experience of joy. And it's one of those things too that joy does really come from within as well. Because I think sometimes people look for things externally, but when you recognize that joy actually is something that's internal. But what I've just realized, I'm even just thinking out loud about it now, and I haven't actually expressed this in this way before, but I think that if we add the smile to that, it's actually making that joy external.
There was some study talking about how, people, if they smile, they just start to feel better. If they start smiling when they talk, if they smile by themselves in a room, like they will start to feel better, kind of like the superhero pose thing where you stand in a power pose for 2 minutes and you start to feel more confident. It's amazing to me how much those physical cues can trick your brain into feeling differently.
It definitely does. And even just, sometimes it could just be, look at yourself in the mirror and smile. And that can be really confronting for people. But yeah, it's something, as I said, it's been a new addition. I've found for me that things just evolve over time. And I think that's also part of my I feel it's I kind of feel a bit of a moral responsibility then now to as I discover these things, as I grow and evolve, then to share that with people. And again, to distill it and share it into the simplest way possible. And it doesn't get much more simple than, hey, smile when you do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the hardest things about bringing your story into your work, whether it's you or anybody trying to bring themselves more into their work, is that it feels so much more personal, right? You're being more vulnerable. You're taking down some of those barriers between the personal and the professional. And when you get feedback, it's all the more difficult to take because it feels more personal. How do you deal with that? How do you get better at accepting that feedback when you're making yourself more vulnerable?
I did a writer's program with Neil Strauss a few years ago. And he said it's important to collect feedback, but it's also then a lot of the time it's up to us what we do with that feedback too. So I think it's receiving the feedback and again, not judging it, not being defensive or anything like that, just being open about it. Yeah, sometimes you'll be able to just take that and you go, "Oh yeah, I see that straight away." And you go, "Yep, this is an opportunity to improve." But yeah, I think that a lot of the time it's collecting it and then examining it and sort of separating those processes. So I think that takes some of the emotion out of it as well. And often, particularly if we're speaking or we're writing or we're even if we're actively seeking feedback, then sometimes it can be just looking at it and going, well, is there something that's coming up over and over again? Maybe I need to look at that. The other thing is too is having a look at, self feedback as well. And particularly as if people are looking at speaking and things like that, is actually to record yourself and then watch it back. And I guess the next level of that is putting a camera on the audience and then watching the audience like back afterwards and seeing where did people really lean in and then where did people get a bit fidgety or maybe just, disconnect a little bit. It's a huge thing, but I think going back to again bringing the personal into the business is that, business is personal. We're all people. And it's, doesn't matter what we're doing. It's business, sales, all of this stuff. It's relationships. And if we don't actually bring ourselves into that, then we can't genuinely make connections. So, and there's going to be times where, you know what, there might going to be a few bumps and bruises along the way, but there are also opportunities to grow as well. So it's just accepting it all. It's the beauty of the human experience, isn't it? Is it's not always going to be, sunshine and rainbows. It's going to be there's going to be some storms along the way, but again, being present and enjoying them all along the way.
That's a really great gift that you can give yourself and everyone else. I know just I was thinking about my experiences as a performer when you were talking about, recording yourself and recording the audience and dancing, singing, being on stage. Like this is feedback that a lot of performers get to record themselves and watch it. And it's also the advice that so few performers take because if you hate getting advice or feedback from somebody else, just wait till you hear your own inner critic reacting to a video of yourself on stage, right? Like, holy cow. And when you talk about being present and accepting, whatever comes, just being open to that and not resisting it, that's such an important practice. That's such an important relationship to have with yourself, to be able to do that for yourself, even before you ask others to do it for you.
Oh, definitely. And I think the first couple of times you do it, oh my gosh, it's so uncomfortable, isn't it? When you're watching that clip back and you start to observe things like, especially that, yeah, as a speaker, you'll see those little, fidgety things that you do, or it might be the filler words that go in there. And even a lot of the time it's like we don't like our own voices, especially when we first started doing that. And I've been working on singing and things like that over the last few years. And sometimes you might do something and you're like, oh wow, that felt really good. Then you listen back and you're like, I actually don't really like my own voice. It's really hard. But then other people are like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. This is like it really connects. And it's a real balancing act, and they're all important, but then I think just, being aware that we are our biggest critics, but also this is where it's also important to record these things over time because then you actually see the progress as well, and so I think that's a big one. We've got to celebrate the progress and rather than being, so critical and trying to look for perfection because it doesn't exist.
Absolutely. I think that's a great reminder to all of us is to know that we're making progress over time and to celebrate that, celebrate showing up. And I really think your story is going to encourage so many more women to share their story and try centering themselves in their story, in their work, in their careers in a whole new way. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share with us. I think that you've set a really powerful example.
Oh, thank you so much. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share. And again, I think Wednesday Women is just such an amazing platform. And I know it's evolved into a community now. And yeah, I think for women to be able to share their story and then for us all to connect with each other. And that's been a huge part of it. So again, thank you for the opportunity and I welcome the opportunity also to connect with other people in the community too.
Everybody add Stacey on LinkedIn. And thank you so much for being part of this community and adding yourself to it so that everybody can benefit and enjoy and grow alongside you. It's so wonderful.
Thanks, Ashley.
Before we end the episode, we want to take a moment to reflect with you, our resilient listeners, about what Stacey's story means to you. How could your story help others? And what's keeping you from telling that story? If today's show inspired you, tell us. Send an email or voice memo to hello@wednesdaywomen.org. Or keep the ripple going by giving us a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Your ratings help us grow and inspire even more people. This podcast is brought to you by Wednesday Women, an organization dedicated to increasing the visibility of women executive leaders. Learn more at wednesdaywomen.org. Thank you to our executive producers, Melissa Moody and Leslie Greenwood. Again, I'm your host, Ashley Lobbs, hoping you'll keep the ripple going. Until next time.